We are very proud of the pioneering role that the University of Minnesota and that the College of Liberal Arts has had in acknowledging the importance of diversity to contemporary America and to promoting the recruitment of diverse faculty and to providing those faculty with the resources they need to conduct innovative teaching and research in those fields. We also remain committed to supporting our students, both undergraduate and graduate, our students of color, and by providing them the resources they need to be successful at this very large research university and to help them plan for successful postgraduate careers. Minnesota, as many of you know, was one of the first institutions to inscribe diversity into the curriculum. And as a result of the provocations of the civil rights movement and the attendant and necessary reflection on the need to create a space for previously underrepresented communities to be heard in the academy, Minnesota took the pioneering step to institutionalize African and African American studies, American Indian studies, Chicano-Chicana studies, women's studies, and more recently, LGBT studies, and within the past decade, Asian American studies, no small challenge in the upper Midwest. Many of these departments and programs have a strong relationship and continue to have a strong relationship of service learning, collaboration, and community engagement to their respective communities, and ties between the Chicano Latino studies and the Minnesota Latino community has been especially deep. Now, the roundtable this afternoon will explore intellectual trends in Chicano-Chicano studies over the last 40 years and explore where the field is going with respect to Latino studies and ethnic studies generally and programmatically in terms of the organizational infrastructure and their place within large universities. But in addition to this scholarly conversation this afternoon, it is also important for us to continue to be mindful of the important role that the department plays in keeping before our students, the next generation of Americans, the ongoing challenges in contemporary American society that still need to be addressed and resolved. And I'm speaking here in the first instance of the DREAM Act that we all hoped for with much longing in 2008, which is now stymied by congressional partisanship, delayed now perhaps inevitably by the election year. And we welcome the daring work of committed individuals in private industry, as reported recently in the Wall Street Journal, and their efforts to fund the education of children of undocumented immigrants and to help them on their path to meaningful professional careers. We need to be inspired by such boldness and connect with it to make the necessary progress. We also need to be continually vigilant to the efforts by others to place limits around the Mexican-American experience and to control, gloss over, and homogenize what it means to be a Mexican-American. And I'm thinking of the recent efforts of the Tucson School Board to prevent the voice of Mexican-American students from being heard and to prevent the work of Mexican-American writers from being read and discussed, especially when so many students are eager to read about themselves and learn more about their heritage in school. As scholars, we can speak collectively about the next stage of Chicano-Latino studies as an interdisciplinary field, connecting the Mexican-American voice to work in post-colonial studies, to globalized American studies, which itself interrogates the category of being American, to exciting work, as heard earlier today, on LGBT studies and gender studies, and to the broader landscape of ethnic studies. But at the same time, we must bear in mind that we do not inhabit an ivory tower or live in a vacuum, and we must not lose sight of the present challenges that threaten to inhibit the full expression of the Chicano-Latino experience in this country. So thank you.
to the early 2000s, and there is a documentary film project, what the maker, Dean Hapeta, who's a native Maori from New Zealand, refers to as a rapumentary film project, in which he travels the globe and sort of plugs into local, on-the-ground, spoken word, hip-hop activists and indigenous rights scenes on virtually every continent. So I have these two kind of seemingly disparate, at odds projects that I'm working on, but I'd like to sort of share a little bit of both of them with you to see if we can, or at least I can, connect some of the dots and maybe make an argument about what each might teach us about Chicano studies. And just to sort of lay out up front, signpost, if you will, what I see as a couple of the major arguments I'd like to make. One is that, as we heard so eloquently this morning in the first panel, and from Jimmy's presentation just a few moments ago, Chicano identity and politics rest historically and currently on what my colleague and friend Juan Flores, the Puerto Rican cultural studies scholar, calls the inter, the intra, and the trans. Thinking of inter as the cross-ethnic and cross-racial, thinking of the intra as those class, gendered, sexual, and other relationships within ethnic groups, and of course the trans as the cross-border and transnational. And I would argue, I hope to do so, that whether we're talking about the 1940s or the 2000s, or as Jimmy's done with the movement era in between, so my projects sort of bookend Jimmy's in a certain way, that the inter, the intra, and the trans are fundamental pillars of Chicano studies, and Chicano history in particular. And the second argument is much in line with what Jimmy has just argued. That is to say that I think we have too often emphasized the discontinuities between different moments of Chicano history as a discipline. That is to say, the World War II generation has been couched as this assimilative Mexican-American generation that was claiming whiteness and seeking to, in many instances, do nothing else except integrate themselves into the fabric of broader American society, while the Chicano movement rejected such strategies and political efforts. And then the current moment has been something of a mishmash, if you read a number of Chicano historians. But I think that what the juxtaposition of these projects do, in my view, is complicate the generational model that too often overemphasizes the discontinuous for the continuous. So essentially it's an argument that the inter and the trans and the intra have always been a part of Chicano history, whether we're talking about Latino soldiers or Zoot Suiters from the World War II era, or hip-hop artists from the 2000s, or anyone in between. So the biggest section that I'll share is actually on the Latino soldiers project, and that's where I'll turn to now.
Coming out today. My own PhD is in ethnic studies, so even though my talk today is positioned within the much broader category of Latinidad, I want to really congratulate the University of Minnesota for celebrating 40 years of Chicano studies. I mean, in this moment where our bodies and our scholarship are really being assaulted on multiple fronts, literally our scholarship is being made illegal in some places, celebrating 40 years is indeed a distinguished and important accomplishment. My talk today will try to do too much. It will begin by thinking about what sort of methodology, archive, and evidence writing about Latino dance might require. It will then consider the kinds of social norms and conventions dance engages, and finally, it will ponder how an understanding of these embodied practices might exist as a way to make sense of other kinds of queer corporeal meaning-making. And this work is taken from my new project, and in the chapter from which this is excerpted, I'm looking at questions of gesture. So I'm looking at gesture through the parallel moves of dance and queer sex. But because this is our first date, right? This is my first time at the University of Minnesota. Today we're just going to dance. We might flirt, but we're just going to dance. As Latinos and as queers, we are often singled out for our gestures. And for the queer Latinos, like, imagínate, right? We are too loud, we're too colorful, we're too touchy-feely, we're too over the top in ways that are both about different cultural understandings of how bodies should occupy space, but also how others read us as always already excessive. Different people have done, studies. I'm not a social scientist, but there's this very famous 1966 study that was about how often different cultures touch each other in the course of an hour. And Puerto Ricans very famously touch each other 180 times an hour. And again, in 1966, they were looking at Londoners who touched them, 0. And French, 0, and the French were like 10, but Puerto Ricans were 180 times. Now, much of the work on gesture is either linguistic or anthropological, where scholars attempt to document through meticulous ethnographic scripting every aspect of movement to record and reproduce for the reader the corporeal performance that they missed. My approach is much closer to performance studies where the context, audience, and sensory ambiance, indeed the very movement of embodied expression, transforms the possibilities for meaning-making. For me, writing about gesture requires, to borrow Peggy Phelan's iconic phrase, representation without reproduction. Rather than work that attempts to code and then decode a series of performative acts through observation and analysis, my talk today considers the ephemeral residue of gesture through the subjective and flawed interpretive lens of memory and interpretation. Turning to memory is an attempt to rewrite the rules of knowledge production, to create a space for what José Esteban Muñoz terms queer evidence, quote, queer in relation to what counts as proof. He writes, and although we cannot simply conserve a person or a performance through documentation, we can perhaps begin to summon up through the auspices of memory the acts and gestures that meant so much to us. In this passage, Muñoz is also describing something equally elusive and ephemeral, how as scholars and readers we live our desire for that which meant so much to us. How we sense the embrace between subjects and objects of inquiry. Thinking about gestures and the materiality of the body generates curious methodological questions. It requires what Anne Svetkovich terms an archive of feeling, and so it was interesting to have you use that term as well. To reimagine the relationship between bodies and objects,
as well as for supporting the refreshments that we have been enjoying. And with more ado, I will introduce University Librarian Wendy Pratt-Bouget.
Well, welcome. It's great to have you all here for this 40th anniversary. And I do hope you've had a chance to go and look at the exhibit downstairs. Raphael did a fabulous job in pulling that together. When I was thinking about this celebration today, I couldn't help but think about the History Center's 1968 museum. Have any of you, I hope, been over to see that? And it's a wonderful chronicle of all of the things that were going on in that time period, the kind of ferment, the kind of groundswell of energy, the important and evolving issues of the day that generated so much more that was to come. Vietnam War, the women's movement, civil rights, to name a few. And it was a time of questioning the status quo and actively seeking change and recognition. The students everywhere made their voices heard, and in that spirit, the Chicana and Chicano students here dreamed of a new department. And that single-minded vision and tenacity led to a very fruitful reality that we have today. Now, 40 years later, the department's mission is strong to cultivate research and teaching and service to the community. And that tripartite mission is important to us too, because it's the very same mission that we embrace. And we've been delighted all these many years to be partners with the department and work hand in hand to fulfill that mission. So I congratulate all of you on the resounding success over these 40 years. And I know that that fiery spirit that gave birth to the department probably burns strong today. So congratulations to you all. And
I want to thank our guests here, faculty on campus, as well as our guest scholars who are part of a fantastic symposium we had today, in which they each presented on their work, and we had a really wide and stimulating range of scholarship presented that I think in some ways we'll be able to easily use as a moment to bounce off of to have this discussion. For those of you who are not at the earlier symposium, I just invite you to pick up a program and get some sense of the range of research presented. And again, as Dean Parente said, this is an important moment for us in terms of the department to be thinking about not only the past 40 years, but like any 40-year-old, you often have that critical moment of like, where am I, what have I been doing, where am I going? And we're at that sort of moment of where we hope we're not going to have a, what do you call it, a 40-year-old?
Midlife crisis.
Midlife crisis, yes, okay. So, in any case, yes, and once you have it, you forget if you have it. Anyway, so what I've done, just so we weren't sure what the setup was going to be, so I'd rather I do have some of the questions on the computer, but they may not be able to be legible. But what I've done is written a few questions down within three categories: reflections on the past and present nature of the field, the current status of the discipline, and then looking forward. So I think it's important to reflect backwards on where we've come as a field, where things are going, where we've been challenged both internally and externally, and then to be thinking about our challenges as we look forward, given the nature of the founding of the Department of Chicano Studies, and both here and around the country. Obviously, these are not just things to be thought of in a vacuum in the ivory tower, but rather how do we fit within the world is really the question. And in the Midwest context, the regional context, as well as the national context, and as our research showed today, within an international, transnational context as well. So what I want to do is, again, rather than have every single person here, and I'll guess up to be honest with you, I just gave them the questions. I didn't send them to them a month ago and say, be pondering on it. But I do know that they think about these things, and it's very apparent in their work that they're thinking about these issues. So I won't have every person respond to every question, but I do ask to indicate that if you're willing to respond, we'll pass it down a mic, and there's one over there that may or may not want to take off the stand. So with respect to reflecting on the past and present nature of the field, I would like, and maybe I'll put one of the historians or one of our senior scholars on under the microscope and ask to characterize the developmental trajectory of the mission and the method of Chicano and Chicano studies since its inception. To identify and discuss at least one major paradigm shift in the field. So that's noteworthy.
My name is Luis Alvarez. I'm visiting from the History Department at UC San Diego. And I'll just respond a bit to this first question about how we might begin to assess and characterize the developmental trajectory and mission of Chicano studies over the last 40 plus years. And this builds, of course, from my own work and a lot of the conversations we had this afternoon, but I would begin to make an argument about Chicano studies as a relational field, as a social movement-based field, and as a transnational field. I think that these three big ideas that Chicanos are embedded in relational experiences with other folks, other non-Chicanos over the span of their historical experience is critical, and is something that has begun to be developed as the field has come of age over the last several decades. That is to say, we don't just study Chicanos, but we study how Chicanos engage, get along with, or don't get along with other folks, other racialized groups, and other folks in communities and places in general. So this notion of a relational Chicano studies, I think, has been a critical development in recent years. I also think, as we heard this afternoon, that this notion of a transnational Chicano studies is critically important, that we're not just talking about experiences, debates, events, and histories that happen within the bounds of the United States, but that the Chicano experience is a cross-border one, a trans-border one since its inception, and that infuses and sort of informs everything that we do about Chicano studies. If these two ideas, sort of the transnational and relational nature of Chicano studies have developed and gained force over the years, I also think, looking backwards, that there have been things from the inception of Chicano studies that have been lost, and that could perhaps be regained and recovered with some generative and productive consequences. And I'm thinking primarily of the social movements-based nature of Chicano studies as a field of study that emerged organically linked to the social movements of the 1960s and early 70s. And I think in some ways that the field of Chicano studies has perhaps not done as well as it could on a national scale in terms of thinking through the continued relationship between the field and its communities off of campus. And I think these moments in the last several years, particularly around immigrant rights organizing, provide an opportunity for the field to sort of really rethink how its reach moves far beyond campuses. So I would just, again, say these relational, transnational, and social movements-based character of Chicano studies are important ways to begin thinking about where the field has been and where it's going.
Anyone else? Major paradigm shifts?
Good afternoon. I'm Jimmy Patiño. I'm assistant professor in the Chicano Studies department here. I just started this year, so it's been a really inspiring and good time to be coming to the department on its 40th anniversary, and has me, reflecting on the history of the department and where my coming here has to do with that, where I can build off of past successes. So it's a pleasure to be here, to be a part of this. I'm thinking about the developmental trajectory of the field. I think it's important to note the shift of attempting to create a Chicano Studies department to represent a community and an identity that exists in society, and the transformation to problematizing that at the same time. In other words, one tenet that I hope my students take from my classes is that Chicanos are not all the same, that while they share a culture, they share certain experiences, they are heterogeneous, they are from different walks of life, different identities, and that these identities are contested and fought over in terms of political trajectory. So I think this has been a general trend in the field. Again, the mission of Chicano Studies was to locate a shared experience and create a space for that shared experience. But as we see I don't know if you can see the question here, but Chicana/Chicano Studies, that was a battle that had to be fought to include the Chicana/O in that identity term. And so my work's on immigrant rights and Mexican American and Mexican immigrant interactions. And so this is another key difference that has been exacerbated many times since the past 40 years. The immigration population has risen. So I think one of the developments is, or maybe the questions that we're left with as Chicano Studies as a process, is how do we both talk about a shared experience alongside talking about a heterogeneous experience within a community, and how does that reflect the larger heterogeneous experience of American society and the broader hemisphere.
I'm Lorena Munoz. I'm a new hire, an assistant professor in geography. I'm very excited to be here and be part of not only the symposium, but actually, the family of Chicano Studies, which is really great. One point that I wanted to also highlight is about the trends in Chicano Studies. It's the inclusivity and kind of like the formation of opportunities for undergraduate students and graduate students that have always been like at the center of all these academic struggles, which is not, you don't see that in other disciplines as much as you see it within Chicano studies, especially with the National Association, right? Being part of the Lesbiana Caucus on Knox, it's just amazing to see that year after year you have this amazing kind of development for undergraduate students and graduate students, not only in the organization, but also in the small microcosms of being able to explore the larger issues that are going on in the discipline and across disciplines, to kind of have a voice of like a queer voice, right? But these are undergraduate students and graduate students actually kind of trying to figure this out in these particular spaces. So I think that that's always been really important about this discipline, and it will definitely continue, which it calls to kind of like the foundation of being, an activist discipline. So.
Let me ask.
Outside of Chicano studies and anthropology, one of the things that I think is what Chicano studies is, how it's been on the cutting edge, is that I think it's finally getting recognition for the kind of scholarship Chicano studies scholars are producing. Because, for example, in the American Anthropology Association meetings, the theme for next year is border crossings. And so, I don't think Chicano studies has gotten the kind of, it doesn't always get the kind of recognition that it merits. Like the work of Loren Saldúa and has transformed, not just Chicano studies, but transformed anthropology in so many ways. And I think finally now there's enough scholars out there in other disciplines that have been trained in Chicano studies that are making more waves in a way that's allowing for Chicano studies to gain that recognition. So I think that's something that's really important, where we are in many ways leading the path, and finally getting recognition for that. And I think the other, the cutting edge, I think the indigenous studies scholarship that's being done in Chicano studies. When I first went to to Knox, and when I was in, I think, my first year after finishing the dissertation, it was just a question. I think I was on the only one of two panels that were talking about indigeneity and its relationship to Chicano studies. And now it's a core part of Chicano studies. So I think that's one area that's really blossomed and that we're going to see some amazing work on in the future.
I'm Cindy Garcia, and I teach in theater arts and dance. And I'm affiliated with Chicano Studies, which it's a very lonely space in between there, because as I navigate between Chicano Studies, which is a very interdisciplinary space, and dance, which is also interdisciplinary, I noticed that Chicano Studies and dance seem very mutually exclusive of each other. And so I really thought about why is that, and how can dance studies, and how has it influenced my work in Chicano Studies, and how has Chicano Studies influenced my work in dance, and how I see some of the theories within dance studies. For example, how do we look at, how do we examine moving bodies, time, space, and moving bodies, choreographically, ethnographically, and how can we look at relationships of power between different social bodies and among social bodies across the border, bodies moving across the border. So I think frameworks of movement within dance can also influence the way that we understand migration, the politics of migration, for example, and our communities, our social politics among us. And so that's kind of my hope for the future, is that there can be more of this overlap between dance and studies of migration and the effects of migration among Chicanos. So I'm delighted, hopefully later a lot of you will be able to come see Sombras. There's Joel Valentin Martinez, who is a Chicano choreographer. I feel like he is the Chicano choreographer who does modern dance. And so over the years I've noticed that Chicanos don't configure within dance studies or in dance. We don't see Chicano choreographers in dance in the same way that we see African American choreographers included. And I don't see dance in the realm of Chicano studies departments. And so, but I really am hoping that we can pull these two areas together, because I feel like there's so many ways that we are starting to intersect, especially through the politics of moving bodies. So that's one of the things I wanted to say.
Hi, my name.
Well, this is my opportunity to make a plug. We just got approval for a doctoral program in Latin American and Latino Studies at UC Santa Cruz, and we will be admitting students in fall of 2014. We're very, very excited about that, and also nervous, frankly, because we're a small department. But I think one of the things in terms of your questions, we really have had to move from being Chicano studies towards Latino studies, and very open about a feminist perspective within that. And part of that comes from, and I think we're not the only department going through this, I hear it happening in Chicano studies all over the place. Our student population is becoming more diverse, and we have lots of different other kinds of students. And so at Santa Cruz, at first it was the Central Americans who were a minority of the students, but they were very clear that we needed to be more inclusive. And more recently, we're a small campus. We're about 18,000 students, but we have a critical mass of Peruvian students, about 30 Peruvian students, and they were really pushing us. We want courses on Peru, and it turns out we were able to hire Silvana Falcon, who happens to be Peruvian and who happens to study transnational social movements that includes Peru. So we totally lucked out. And we keep saying, okay, what's the next wave? And we hear there are some Colombian students on campus. So I think we're going to become even more diverse. And I think that this pressure is something that lots of departments are dealing with, and I think we need to engage the debates that the students are raising. Like, one of the things they point out repeatedly is that we need to be aware of the way in which our curriculum is Chicano-centric, or they even use the term the hegemony of Mexicanism. And we're like, what? Don't you know we struggled for this field? And so that sort of pushes us into different kinds of interrogations of our own field in ways that I think is really productive. And I think that is, we're spilling into the future directions, but I think that is one of the directions that many of the Chicano and Chicano Studies departments will have to deal with. My department is 11 years old, and we very deliberately and carefully put together Latino Studies and Latin American Studies. And it was a very long process of, we got funding through the Ford Foundation, their Crossing Borders program. We brought in scholars from Latin American Studies and from Chicano Latino Studies, and sort of talk through how do we do this. And lots of people have asked us, what are you guys doing? Like, why would you in Chicano Latino Studies, hook up with the folks in Latin American Studies? And on different campuses, those are different worlds. And I think some of the things that we have learned is to be very open about how Chicano Latino Studies is a political project, and to find allies among people who work in Latin American Studies. So it just so happened on our campus, we were so small that the folks working in Latin American Studies were very involved in politics and critical ways of looking at history, and so that we were sort of fellow travelers, if you will. And so the work of collaboration sort of began with sort of political solidarity, if you will. Through this Ford project, then we began to bring in scholars and to sort of explicitly try to think through the conceptual work. How do you do transnational or cross-border work? And again, people kept emphasizing that you need to do it carefully, and you need to be aware of the ways in which sometimes you cannot collaborate together. We came up with a framework that we call conceptual translations, where we really try to emphasize how you can bridge Latin American and Latino studies very selectively. You can't just sort of throw folks together and assume that they become integrated wholeheartedly. You really have to very carefully link the two projects, aware of the respective histories and tensions and how those are ongoing. We had a little reality check at the time before last, when LASA was held in Rio. It turned out in the Latin American Studies Association, there's a Latino section, and it's pretty small, and we're struggling to gain visibility. But for a hot moment, there was talk of dissolving the Latino Studies section within LASA, and a bunch of us were shocked, and we began to sort of try to organize, and we got reinstated, and we're now, I think, in good. We're fine. We're not going to be dissolved. But it sort of was a reminder that putting Latin American and Latino studies together is a delicate project, and I think we always need to be mindful of how to negotiate that.